If you think you've heard every mystery the world has to offer, think again. Smash that subscribe button, hit the bell, and drop a comment if you dare. Because what you're about to witness will haunt your dreams tonight. February 26, 1959, the Ural Mountains, Soviet Russia. Search and rescue volunteer Mikhail Shuravin stood at the edge of a snow-covered slope, his breath forming ghosts in the freezing air. What he saw before him defied explanation. A tent, ripped open from the inside. Fabric shredded as if clawed by desperate hands. Snow had already begun to reclaim it. But the violence of whatever happened here was unmistakable. They cut their way out, Shuravin whispered to his colleague, his voice barely audible over the wind that screamed across the mountain face. From the inside, the tent belonged to 9 experienced hikers, led by 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, who had set out 3 weeks earlier on what should have been a routine expedition to Otorten Mountain. They were all students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, the best and brightest, prepared for harsh conditions. They had promised to send a telegram upon their return by February 12. That telegram never came. Inside the abandoned tent, investigators found everything: boots lined up neatly, warm jackets hung on makeshift hooks, cameras with film still loaded, food rations untouched, a diary with the last entry dated February 1st, describing good weather and high spirits, but no hikers. It was as if they had vanished into the Siberian night wearing nothing but their underclothes. Lead investigator Lev Ivanov arrived at the scene 3 days later, his face weathered by years of solving crimes across the Soviet Union. He had seen murder scenes, suicides, accidents, but nothing had prepared him for what the Ural Mountains were about to reveal. 9 people don't just abandon shelter in negative 40 degrees. Ivanov muttered, examining the tent's interior, not unless they were running from something absolutely terrifying. The first bodies were discovered near the tree line, almost a mile from the tent. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko, found beneath a towering cedar tree, frozen solid. They were barefoot, dressed only in underwear. The branches above them had been broken, suggesting someone had climbed high, desperately looking for something, or trying to escape something. Between the cedar and the tent, rescuers found 3 more bodies, scattered across the slope. Igor Dyatlov himself, found in a position suggesting he was trying to crawl back to the tent. Zinaida Kolmogorova, her hands clenched into fists, frozen mid-struggle. Rustem Slobodin, with a fractured skull, lying face down in the snow. But 4 hikers were still missing. Ivanov studied the scene with growing unease. The pattern made no sense. These were experienced outdoorsmen, yet they had fled their only shelter in the dead of night, inadequately dressed, into a blizzard that would certainly kill them. The question that haunted him, the question that would haunt investigators for decades, was simple yet impossible to answer. What could terrify 9 people so completely that certain death in the freezing wilderness seemed like the better option? The search continued through March, teams combing the mountain in increasingly desperate sweeps. The weather worsened, hope faded. Then, on May 4th, almost 2 months after the initial discovery, the remaining 4 bodies were found in a ravine beneath 4 meters of snow. This is where the case transformed from tragic mystery into something far more sinister. The bodies of Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibobrinyol, and Alexander Kolovatov were found in a state that shocked even the most hardened investigators. They were better dressed than the others, wearing clothes that appeared to have been cut from the bodies found earlier. But their injuries were catastrophic. Dr. Boris Vozrozdeny, the medical examiner, stood in the morgue, his report trembling slightly in his hands. These injuries, he began, his voice tight, are consistent with an extreme force. The kind of force you'd see in a high-speed car crash. Lyudmila's chest cavity was completely crushed, ribs snapped like twigs. Nikolai's skull fractured with such force that it had caved inward. Yet, Dr. Vozrozdeny noted something that made his blood run cold. There were no external wounds, no cuts, no bruises. It was as if an enormous pressure had simply, impossibly, crushed them from the outside. But that wasn't the most disturbing detail. Lyudmila's tongue was missing, cut out or torn from her mouth, along with her eyes and part of her facial tissue. Investigator Ivanov returned to his office in Sverdlovsk, spreading crime scene photographs across his desk. He had been ordered to close the case quickly, to attribute the deaths to a compelling natural force and move on. But questions burned in his mind, questions that wouldn't let him sleep. Why did they flee the tent so violently? What force could cause such devastating internal injuries without external trauma? Why were some bodies more damaged than others, and why? When he examined the clothing under ultraviolet light, did it glow with traces of radioactive contamination? He opened the case file one more time, reading through witness statements from nearby villages, multiple reports of strange orange lights in the sky on the night of February 1st. Bright spheres floating above the mountain range, moving in patterns that defied explanation. Ivanov lit a cigarette with shaking hands and stared at the photograph of the tent, ripped open from within. The Soviet authorities officially closed the Dyatlov Pass case on May 28, 1959, declaring the deaths were caused by an unknown compelling force. The area was sealed off to the public for 3 years. All case files were classified. But when they opened the sealed records decades later, what investigators found changed everything. Hidden within the files was a detail that had been deliberately omitted from the official report, a detail so disturbing that it had been buried by Soviet officials, hoping it would never see the light of day. Investigator Lev Ivanov couldn't sleep. It had been 3 weeks since the case was officially closed, but every night he saw them. 9 faces, frozen in terror, their eyes asking him the question he couldn't answer: why? He sat in his apartment in Sverdlovsk, a bottle of vodka on the table, and touched. In his hands, he held copies of documents he had made before surrendering the original files. Documents he was never supposed to keep. Documents that could end his career, or worse. The knock on his door at 2 a.m. made his heart stop. Lev Ivanov, the voice was calm, authoritative. 2 men in military uniforms stood in his doorway, their faces expressionless. You are requested to report to the district prosecutor's office. Immediately, the prosecutor's office was empty except for 3 men Ivanov didn't recognize. They wore civilian clothes, but everything about them screamed military intelligence. KGB. Comrade Ivanov, the oldest one spoke, his voice like ice. We understand you've been having difficulty accepting the official conclusion of the Dyatlov investigation. Ivanov's throat went dry. I closed the case as ordered, but you've been asking questions, speaking to witnesses again, requesting access to military records for the area. The man leaned forward, his eyes boring into Ivanov's. This is problematic. 9 people died. I want to know what killed them. You already know what killed them. An unknown compelling force. Avalanche. Perhaps panic, the cold. Does it matter? It matters because the evidence doesn't support any of those explanations. The room fell silent. The man pulled out a folder, placing it on the table between them. Let me tell you what you will do, Comrade Ivanov. You will forget this case. You will destroy any copies you made. You will never speak of what you saw in those mountains. Do you understand? And if I don't? The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then we will find evidence of your involvement in anti-Soviet activities. Your family will suffer, your career will end, you will disappear. It's quite simple. Ivanov left that meeting knowing the truth would die with him. But what he didn't know was that other people had been asking questions too, people who couldn't be silenced so easily. Yuri Yudin was the 10th member of the Dyatlov expedition. He had turned back on January 28 due to severe joint pain, just days before the group reached their final campsite. He was the only survivor, the only one who could speak for the dead. In March 1959, while the last 4 bodies still lay undiscovered beneath the snow, Yudin had been brought in to identify the belongings found in the tent. He had stood in that evidence room, touching jackets, boots, cameras that belonged to his friends. The investigators asked him routine questions. He gave routine answers. But Yudin noticed something they didn't think he noticed. Igor Dyatlov's possessions was a compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. It was damaged, they told him. Broken in the incident, but Yudin knew that compass. Igor had used it just days before. It had Worked perfectly. Weeks later, Yudin received an unexpected visitor. An old woman from the village of Vijay, located near the mountain pass. She sat in his small dormitory room, her hands shaking as she poured tea. My grandson was part of the search party, she said quietly. He found something. Something they made him give to the military men. What did he find? She reached into her coat and pulled out a small piece of fabric. It was charred, burned at the edges, but unmistakably from the hiker's clothing. He kept this piece. He said there were others, all burned, scattered in the snow far from any fire. And he said. She hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. He said some of the clothing glowed in the dark. Yudin took the fabric, his hands trembling. Did he tell the investigators? He tried. They told him he was mistaken. That he saw nothing. 2 weeks later, he had an accident, fell from a roof while repairing it. He's in the hospital now, may never walk again. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. It wasn't an accident. That same week, Dr. Boris Vozrozdeny, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsies, contacted several of his colleagues at the university. In hushed conversations over drinks, away from listening ears, he shared his true findings. The force required to cause those injuries, he told them, would be equivalent to a car crash at high speed, but there were no cars, no falling rocks, no avalanche debris in their lungs. The crushing was uniform, as if applied by immense pressure from all directions simultaneously. One colleague asked the question they were all thinking. Could it have been military testing, a bomb, pressure wave? Vozrozdeny shook his head. I tested for that. The pattern is wrong. And it doesn't explain the missing soft tissue. Lyudmila's tongue, eyes, part of her face, removed with precision. Not torn by animals. The edges were too clean. What are you saying, Boris? The doctor's face was pale. I'm saying I don't know what happened to them, and that terrifies me more than any explanation I could imagine. Meanwhile, in the mountains, hikers and hunters who ventured into the area reported strange occurrences. Equipment malfunctioning, compasses spinning, a constant feeling of being watched. Several groups turned back, unable to explain their overwhelming sense of dread. The Mansi people, indigenous to the region, had their own explanation. They called the mountain Kolitsayakal, dead mountain in their language. For generations, they had avoided the northern slope where the hikers died. Their elders spoke of lights in the sky, of people who ventured there and never returned, of an ancient presence that guarded the mountain and punished those who trespassed. When Soviet investigators had interviewed Mansi guides during the search, they had dismissed these stories as superstition, but after the case was closed, several Mansi hunters came forward with new information. Information they had been too afraid to share with authorities. On the night of February 1st, they had seen lights. Not stars, not planes, spheres of orange fire that moved across the sky with impossible speed, hovering over the exact location where the tent would later be found. The lights had remained there for over an hour before shooting straight up into the atmosphere and vanishing. We tried to tell the soldiers, one hunter explained to a journalist years later. But they said we were drunk or lying. They said if we spoke of it again, we would be arrested for spreading false information. Back in Sverdlovsk, Yuri Yudin continued his own investigation in secret. He obtained copies of weather reports, military activity logs, and witness statements through friends and carefully cultivated connections. Piece by piece, he assembled a picture that the official investigation had deliberately ignored. On February 1, 1959, the Soviet military had been conducting weapons tests in the region. Not nuclear, but something else, something so classified that even decades later, the records remained sealed. Multiple witnesses across a 100-kilometer radius reported seeing strange lights and hearing unusual sounds that night. Yudin discovered something else. The film from the cameras found in the tent had been developed. Most of the photos showed normal expedition scenes, happy hikers, beautiful landscapes, but the last roll, from Igor's camera, showed something different. The final frames were blurry, taken in darkness or near darkness, showing in clear shapes and what appeared to be lights in the distance. Those photographs were removed from the evidence file and never seen again. In June 1959, Yudin received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence, written in a handwriting he didn't recognize: "Stop looking, or you will join them." He burned the letter immediately, but he didn't stop looking. Years passed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Files began to open. Journalists and researchers descended on the Dyatlov case, each with their own theories: avalanche, infrasound causing panic, secret military tests, KGB, execution, paradoxical undressing from hypothermia. But none of these theories explained everything. The crushing injuries without external trauma, the radiation, the missing tongue, the orange lights, the tent ripped open from inside. The sheer terror that must have driven them into the deadly cold. In 2019, 60 years after the incident, the Russian government reopened the case. They promised answers. They promised transparency. After months of investigation, they released their official conclusion: avalanche. Researchers who had spent decades studying the case were outraged. The evidence didn't support it. There had been no avalanche debris. The slope angle was too gentle. The injuries were inconsistent. It was, they said, another cover-up. But in a small apartment in Moscow, Yuri Yudin, now an old man, read the news with a bitter smile. He had lived with the truth for 60 years, a truth he could never prove. A truth that had cost him friendships, relationships, peace of mind. He opened his safe and pulled out a file he had kept hidden for 6 decades. Inside were documents, photographs, witness statements, and a letter written in his own hand, to be opened only after his death. A letter that detailed everything he had discovered, everything he suspected, everything that had been hidden. The letter began with a single sentence that would shake the foundations of the official story. Igor Dyatlov sent a coded message in his final diary entry, a message I only understood years later. Yudin sealed the envelope and placed it back in the safe. 3 months later, Yuri Yudin died of natural causes at the age of 75. When his estate was processed, the safe was opened. But the envelope was gone, along with every document related to the Dyatlov Pass incident. Someone had been watching him until the very end. April 2, 2013, a research laboratory in Stockholm, Sweden. Dr. Olena Petrov stared at the computer screen, her coffee growing cold beside her. She had been working on a routine analysis of historical radiation data from Soviet-era incidents when she stumbled across something that made no sense. Radiation signatures from the Ural Mountains in early February 1959, picked up by atmospheric monitoring stations across Scandinavia. The isotopes were unusual, the pattern inconsistent with any known nuclear test of that era. She cross-referenced the dates: February 1st through 3rd, 1959, the exact time frame of the Dyatlov incident. Alena had read about the case years ago, dismissing it as tragic but explainable. Now, looking at this data that had been buried in archives for over 50 years, she wasn't so sure. She picked up her phone and called her colleague in Moscow. "Dmitry, I need you to access the old Soviet military records. Ural region, February 1959, specifically, weapons testing schedules." There was a long pause. "Alena, those files are still classified." "Why?" "Because I think the Dyatlov hikers walked into something they were never supposed to see." For the next 3 months, Alena and a small team of researchers worked in secret, piecing together fragments of information from declassified documents, atmospheric data, and witness testimonies that had been ignored or suppressed. What they discovered was a pattern that revealed the truth the Soviet government had spent decades hiding. In late 1958, the Soviet military began testing a new type of weapon in the northern Urals, not nuclear, but something designed to create extreme pressure waves and localized electromagnetic disturbances. The project was codenamed Kolet, ironically using the Mansi word for the mountain where it would claim its first civilian casualties. The tests were scheduled for remote areas, far from population centers. But the Dyatlov group, experienced hikers who knew the region well, had chosen a route that brought them directly into the testing zone. Their expedition had been registered with the university's sports club. But that information never reached the military units conducting the tests. On the evening of February 1, 1959, the hikers made camp on the slope of Koletsyagl. According to Igor Dyatlov's diary, they had decided to cache some equipment and make a push for the summit the next day. They were excited, optimistic, unaware that military observers had spotted their tent through surveillance equipment and were frantically trying to reach command to halt the scheduled test. The communication failed. Radio interference from the very weapon they were testing prevented the message from getting through. At approximately 9:30 p.m., the weapon was activated. What happened next was captured in the fragmented final entries of the hikers' diaries and the last photographs on their cameras. Evidence that investigator Ivanov had seen but was ordered to suppress. The weapon created an intense pressure field combined with electromagnetic radiation. The effect was devastating. The hikers inside the tent felt it first as a crushing sensation, a pressure that made breathing impossible. The fabric of the tent began to glow with ionized air. Their metal equipment, zippers, buttons, became searingly hot. Panic struck instantly and completely. In their desperation to escape the crushing force and burning metal, they slashed through the tent from inside and fled into the snow. Barely clothed because their metal-fastened clothing was burning their skin, the weapon pulsed. The hikers ran down the slope, some trying to reach the tree line for shelter, others attempting to navigate back to the tent once the immediate pressure released. But the damage was done. The electromagnetic field had destroyed their sense of direction. Their compasses spun uselessly. The radiation exposure had already begun poisoning their cells. The crushing injuries came from the weapon's second pulse, a more focused burst that caught four of the hikers in the ravine where they had taken shelter. The pressure wave collapsed their chest cavities and fractured their skulls with invisible force. Just as Dr. Vozrozdeny had documented, death was instantaneous. The others died slowly from hypothermia, wandering in the darkness. Unable to find their way back to safety, their bodies already weakened by radiation exposure. By the time military units reached the site the next morning, they found the tent destroyed and no sign of the hikers. The cleanup crew removed evidence of the weapon's effects, the glowing fabric, the damaged equipment, the photographs showing the lights in the sky. They left just enough to create confusion, enough to ensure no clear story could emerge. When search parties found the bodies weeks later, the military observers ensured the investigation would reach no definitive conclusion. Witness statements were altered. Evidence was confiscated. Investigators like Ivanov were threatened into silence. The case was closed with a deliberately vague explanation that answered nothing. When Elena presented her findings at a closed conference in Geneva in September 2013, the reaction was immediate and hostile. Russian officials demanded she hand over her data. Her research funding was suddenly and mysteriously cut. Colleagues who had worked with her just days before were now unreachable. The message was clear: stop talking, or face the consequences. But Elena was smarter than that. She had learned from the mistakes of the past, from the fate of Yuri Yudin, the 10th hiker who turned back and was silenced. Before going public, she had distributed copies of her explosive research to journalists, academics, and government officials in multiple countries. This time, the truth couldn't be completely buried. Then, in December 2013, a ghost from the past emerged. Anatoly Belov, a former Soviet military officer, decided to come forward. In 1959, he was just a young lieutenant stationed in the Urals. Now, he was dying of cancer and no longer cared about repercussions. In a videotaped interview, his voice weak but his words crystal clear, he confirmed everything. "We were testing a pressure weapon," he confessed. "We didn't know there were civilians in the area. When we realized what had happened, our orders were to contain it, to make sure no one ever knew the truth. Those hikers, they were innocent victims of our secrecy, our paranoia. I've lived with that guilt for 54 years. Anatoly Belov died just 3 weeks after his interview was published. Immediately, Russian officials dismissed his testimony as the confused ramblings of a dying man. But the details he provided matched Elena's research too perfectly to be a coincidence. The gears of truth began to turn, slowly at first, then gaining unstoppable momentum. Documentaries were made. Books were written. The story spread like wildfire across the internet. Facing mounting international pressure, the Russian government reopened the investigation in 2019, but their conclusion was not the one the world was waiting for. Instead of admitting military involvement, they doubled down on the avalanche theory. It was a final, desperate attempt to close the case with a natural explanation, absolving everyone of responsibility. The families of the 9 hikers, now elderly themselves, outright rejected this official conclusion. They knew their loved ones were experienced mountaineers who would never, ever camp in a location prone to avalanches. They knew the horrific injuries, the crushed ribs. The missing eyes didn't match a natural disaster. They knew, 60 years later, that they were still being lied to. Today, the Dyatlov Pass remains one of the most compelling and investigated mysteries in modern history. Tourists flock to the site, standing on the desolate slope where the tent once stood, trying to imagine the sheer terror of that final night. A memorial plaque lists 9 names, 9 young, vibrant people who set out for a grand adventure and found something far more sinister waiting for them in the Siberian wilderness. But here's the part of the story that most people don't know. This is what Elena's research revealed, the detail that has been largely overlooked. The terrifying weapon tested that night was never deployed again, and it wasn't because of the Dyatlov incident. The Soviet military had successfully covered that up for decades. No. It was abandoned because they couldn't control it. The pressure waves it generated were wildly unpredictable. The electromagnetic effects were too widespread, frying electronics and disrupting communications over vast areas. The weapon was deemed too dangerous, too uncontrollable. Even by the ruthless standards of the Cold War, the prototypes were ordered to be destroyed. Research facilities were dismantled. The scientists who worked on the project were either reassigned or, in some cases, simply disappeared. The Soviet Union was desperate to ensure this technology could never be recreated, and more importantly, never be traced back to them. But secrets have a way of surfacing. In 2021, seismic monitoring stations picked up strange readings from the northern Urals. They were faint, but unmistakable. Pressure anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, the exact same signatures Elena had identified from the 1959 incident. The readings lasted for 3 days before stopping as mysteriously as they had begun. During that time, hikers in the area reported an overwhelming and inexplicable sense of dread. Their equipment malfunctioned. Their compasses spun uselessly. These were the same bizarre phenomena reported by people visiting the pass for decades after the original tragedy. Official scientists offered plausible explanations: underground gas releases, magnetic anomalies in the region's rock formations, rare natural phenomena that just happened to mimic the 1959 readings. But for the researchers who had dedicated their lives to the Dyatlov case, this was no coincidence. They knew. They knew that whoever tested that weapon in 1959 might have hidden it, but they never fully destroyed it. Or perhaps, something even stranger had occurred. Perhaps the mountain itself had absorbed the energy from that night, retaining it, holding it within its rock and snow. A permanent, invisible scar on the landscape, an echo of the horror that can't be erased. Dead Mountain, as the indigenous Mansi people had always called it, had earned its name long before those 9 Russian hikers learned why. Then, in 2024, the final piece of the puzzle came to light. The last photograph ever taken by the Dyatlov expedition was discovered in the private collection of a deceased KGB officer. The image is haunting. It shows the view from inside the tent, looking out through the open flap into the frigid night. And in the distance, barely visible against the black sky, is a light. It's not a star. It's not a plane. It's a sphere of orange fire, hovering directly above their position. On the back of the photograph, a message was scrawled in Igor Dyatlov's own handwriting. It was a single, desperate word: run. What happened at Dyatlov Pass was not an accident. It was a cover-up of a catastrophic military failure. A secret kept for over 60 years. The truth is often more terrifying than any fiction we can Imagine. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest unsolved mysteries. They did run, but there was nowhere to go. The weapons range covered the entire mountainside. They were dead the moment the test began. They just didn't know it yet. Most dismiss it as imagination, the power of suggestion fueled by knowing the area's dark history. But some researchers believe the electromagnetic disturbance has never fully dissipated. That the mountain still holds traces of what happened there. Echoes of that terrible night replaying endlessly in the rock and snow and wind. 9 young people went into those mountains seeking adventure. They found a truth so dangerous that governments spent 60 years hiding it. A truth about weapons designed to kill without leaving evidence, about the absolute power of states to erase inconvenient victims, about how easily terror can be rebranded as mystery. The official case remains closed. Avalanche, they say. Natural disaster. And some mountains demand a price from anyone who dares to learn their secrets. And every year, drawn by curiosity or obsession or disbelief, more people make the trek to find answers. The mountain welcomes them all. After all, it's been hungry for a very long time.